There is a sound beneath the world that you have never been taught to listen for. It does not travel through air. It travels through stone, through deep, compacted soil, through the kind of earth that has not been touched by light since before the first human hand pressed a mark into wet clay. You are lying still now, and if you allow the noise of the present moment to fall away, you can almost feel it, moving up through the floor, through the bed, through the slow architecture of your resting body. A vibration, a presence, something vast and patient and very, very old. This is where we begin tonight. Not in a library, not in a lecture hall. In the dark, where the oldest knowledge has always lived, where it has been waiting for you with the particular calm of something that has never once doubted it would eventually be found. The text that concerns us tonight is Job, chapter 40, beginning at verse 15. It is one of the most compressed, most charged, and most deliberately misread passages in the entire Hebrew Bible. And the misreading did not happen by accident. It happened by design, across centuries, in council chambers and scriptoria, in the careful deliberations of men who understood exactly what they were doing when they looked at a description of an entity with bones like bronze beams and a tail that swept the air like a great cedar, and wrote the word hippopotamus in the margin. That single word has functioned as a seal, a bureaucratic lid pressed down over something that the ancient world knew was not an animal, not in any sense the modern world means when it uses that word. Tonight, we lift that lid, slowly, together. To understand what Behemoth actually is, you must first understand the world in which the Book of Job was written, and the world that was already old when that writing began. The oral traditions embedded in Job stretch back somewhere between 2,000 and 1,000 years before the Common Era, which means their roots reach into a Near Eastern cosmological universe that most people in the modern world have never been introduced to. This was not a world that separated the physical from the sacred, the natural from the cosmic. In the ancient Near Eastern mind, the great creatures of the earth were not simply biological organisms. They were participants in the structure of existence. They held positions. They occupied domains. They were woven into the architecture of how the world was organized and maintained, the way that columns hold up a ceiling, invisible in their purpose until the moment they are removed. The idea that a creature could be merely large, merely impressive, merely an animal of unusual size, would have been a category error in this worldview. Size, in the ancient cosmological framework, was always a sign, always a language, always pointing somewhere deeper. Imagine the scribes who first committed this passage to parchment, not in a bright room, in a room lit by oil lamps that threw unsteady amber light across rough stone walls and the long horizontal surface of a writing table worn smooth by decades of use. The smell of the ink, dark and mineral, the sound of the stylus or the reed pen moving carefully, deliberately, because every mark was considered before it was made. These men did not write quickly. They did not write carelessly. When they chose the word behemoth, the plural of majesty, the grammatical form reserved for things of such overwhelming singular nature that the singular form was structurally inadequate to contain them, they were doing something precise and intentional. They were placing this entity in a specific category, the same category as Elohim, the same grammatical house as God. This is not a detail that commentaries tend to linger on. You will not find it emphasized in the study notes of most modern Bible editions, and the reason for that omission is not scholarly oversight. It is the same reason that the tale was reinterpreted, that the bones of bronze were explained away, that the rivers drunk without panic were made to fit the profile of a creature that ancient Egyptian hunters harvested from the Nile, with the casual confidence of men doing an unpleasant but entirely manageable job. The plural of majesty applied to Behemoth is a thread, and if you pull it, the entire official interpretation unravels. Because once you acknowledge that the scribes placed this creature in the grammatical category of the divine, the hippopotamus becomes not a scholarly interpretation, but a very specific kind of erasure. There is a phrase in the ancient Near Eastern tradition that translates roughly as the weight of the first things. It refers to the primordial epoch, the time before the ordered cosmos, before light and dark were separated, before the waters above were divided from the waters below. This was not understood as a metaphorical prehistory. It was understood as a real and still present dimension of existence, a layer of reality that the ordered world of human experience was built on top of, the way a city is built on foundations that most of its inhabitants never see and rarely think about. The creatures of that primordial epoch, the things that existed in the weight of the first things, did not simply disappear when the ordered world was established. They were held. They were contained. They were assigned domains, given positions at the margins of the ordered cosmos, kept in a state of managed suspension that the ancient world understood as entirely different from extinction. Extinction meant gone. The primordial creatures were not gone. They were waiting. Behemoth is one of those waiting things. The text of Job places it in the present tense, not the past. God does not say to Job that there was once a creature of this kind. He says, "Behold, look at it now, consider it. Let its existence reset your understanding of what creation actually contains." The whirlwind speech of God in chapters 38 through 41 is structured as a catalog of the things that human knowledge and human power cannot encompass, and Behemoth is presented as the terrestrial pinnacle of that catalog, the land-dwelling counterpart to Leviathan in the deep waters, together forming a kind of cosmic parenthesis around the ordered world, the wild and untamable forces that define the outer boundary of what civilization can claim to understand or control. Settle deeper now. Let the weight of that image rest with you. A boundary, a thing that stands at the edge of what can be known, patient as stone, indifferent to the centuries accumulating above it like layers of silt. Behemoth is not finished. Behemoth is not past. It is the kind of presence that does not experience time the way you do, the way the institutions that tried to name and contain it do. It was there before the scribes. It was there before the councils. It is there in the text, exactly where it was placed, in Job 40, waiting with the unhurried certainty of something that has never had any reason to be afraid of being forgotten. The physical description in Job 40 is where the containment strategy becomes most visible, and where the most careful reading yields the most disquieting results. The text does not offer abstractions. It offers specifics. Bones like tubes of bronze, limbs like bars of iron, a tail that moves like a cedar. These are not the measurements of a creature that anyone in the ancient world was observing from a safe distance at the edge of a river. These are the measurements of something that required a different kind of witness, a different kind of seeing. The way that certain things can only be described by someone who has stood in the presence of something so far outside the normal scale of experience that ordinary language begins to buckle under the weight of the attempt. Consider what bronze meant in the ancient Near Eastern world. This was not a decorative material. Bronze was the hardest working substance that civilization had yet produced, the material of weapons and structural elements, of the things that were expected to bear weight and resist force and endure. When the scribe reached for bronze as the comparison for Behemoth's bones, they were not reaching for beauty. They were reaching for structural permanence, for the idea of a skeleton so dense, so engineered for load-bearing, that the human vocabulary for strength was barely adequate to gesture toward it. bars of iron for the limbs, bronze for the bones. These are not the words of a naturalist observing a hippopotamus in shallow water. These are the words of someone trying to describe a weight of being that presses against the outer limit of what language can hold. And then there is the tale. You need to stay with the tale for a moment, because this is the place where the official interpretation collapses most completely, where the seam between the text and the explanation pulled over it becomes impossible to ignore once you have seen it. The tale of a hippopotamus is a small thing. It measures perhaps a foot in length on a fully grown adult. A short muscular appendage used primarily for the dispersal of waste, not a feature that any observer, ancient or modern, would think to compare to one of the great trees of the ancient world. The cedars of Lebanon were not simply large trees. They were among the most culturally significant organisms in the entire Near Eastern world. Massive, deeply rooted, ancient beyond the memory of any living person, their timber so dense and so resistant to decay that kings measured their own greatness by how much cedar they could command. Solomon's temple required cedar. The palaces of Mesopotamia required cedar. Entire military campaigns were organized around the acquisition of cedar, because cedar represented permanence, solidity, the kind of structural integrity that ordinary timber could not provide. When the scribe wrote that Behemoth moved his tail like a cedar, they were invoking all of that weight, the slow arc of something enormous. The movement of mass so great that the air itself had to accommodate it, had to part and resettle around it, the way deep water resettles around something that is moved through it long after the movement has stopped. The only creatures whose tails could have warranted this comparison, whose tail movement would have demanded this particular word and no other, were the great sauropods, the long-necked giants of the Mesozoic, whose tails extended 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet behind them, counterweights to necks and bodies of almost incomprehensible tonnage, sweeping slowly through the air with exactly the kind of weighted, deliberate arc that the cedar comparison is trying to convey. Now let the question settle gently into you, the way dust settles in a room that has been undisturbed for a long time. How did the ancient scribes of the Near East arrive at this description? The standard institutional answer is that they did not, that the creature was a hippopotamus, and the description was simply poetic exaggeration, metaphor stretched beyond proportion for rhetorical effect. But this answer requires you to believe that the same scribes who were otherwise extraordinarily precise in their language, who weighed every word, who used the plural of majesty with full awareness of its theological implications, who constructed some of the most carefully wrought literature in the ancient world, suddenly abandoned all precision when it came to the most important creature in God's catalog of untamable things, and simply made up measurements that bore no relationship to any creature they had ever observed. The more coherent answer requires you to think about what the ancient Near Eastern world actually contained. The Jordan Valley, the Negev, the regions of the Levant where the biblical tradition was formed and preserved. These are not geologically inert landscapes. They are landscapes with deep Cretaceous fossil beds, places where the bones of genuinely enormous prehistoric animals have been emerging from the earth for as long as the earth has been wearing away. The ancient world found these bones. They did not have a paleontological framework for understanding what they were, which means that when a community found the partial skeleton of a massive prehistoric animal eroding out of a hillside or exposed by a seasonal flood, they did what every human culture has done with inexplicable physical evidence throughout history. They built a story around it. They encoded what they found into the cosmological language they had available. They made it mean something, because the alternative, the shrug, The recorded observation without interpretation was not a cognitive option in a world where everything that existed was understood to exist for a reason. The scholar Adrian Mayer spent years tracing this process across multiple cultures and continents, and what she found was not a collection of isolated coincidences. It was a pattern. Fossil sites and mythological traditions overlapping with a consistency that pointed toward something systematic, toward the ancient world doing exactly what you would expect it to do when confronted with the physical remains of creatures it had no other category for. The griffins of the ancient Mediterranean appear to trace back to protoceratops skulls found by nomadic peoples in the Gobi Desert. Skulls with a beak structure and a cranial crest that align remarkably with the classical griffin profile. The giants of Southern European and Near Eastern mythology cluster around precisely the regions where mammoth and mastodon bones have been found in significant quantities. And in the Levant itself, in the specific geography where Job's tradition was formed and maintained, the fossil record contains exactly the kind of enormous, structurally impressive remains that could have given a careful observer the impression of bronze-density bone, of a skeletal architecture built for a weight that no living creature in their experience was required to bear. You are drifting now, through the long corridor of that ancient geology, through the deep time that lies beneath the soil of every landscape where these stories were told. The bones were there before the stories. The stories were built around the bones. And the stories pointed, with more accuracy than the institutions that came after them were comfortable acknowledging, towards something real, something physical, something that once moved through the world with the slow, cedar-like arc of a tale that no language could quite contain. But the physical evidence, compelling as it is, only takes you so far into the actual nature of Behemoth. Because the text of Job is not a natural history document, it was never meant to be one. And the deeper you move into what the surrounding ancient world actually believed about this entity, the more clearly you begin to understand that the debate between dinosaur and hippopotamus has always been a distraction, a way of keeping the inquiry inside a box where it can be managed, where the most unsettling implications of the text never have to be confronted directly. The ancient Near Eastern world did not think about Behemoth as a species. It thought about Behemoth as a position, a function, a load-bearing element in the architecture of existence itself, the way that certain stones in a very old wall are not simply stones, but the reason the wall is still standing. There is a moment in Job 40 that most readers pass over without registering its full weight. God tells Job that Behemoth was made along with him. The Hebrew phrasing is careful and deliberate, as Hebrew phrasing always is, and it carries the sense of made as well as you, made in the same act, made in the same category of being, sharing an ontological origin with the human creature standing before the whirlwind. This is a statement of profound cosmological intimacy. It places Behemoth not in the divine, uncreated realm, not in the category of the angels or the seraphim or the celestial beings that populate the higher registers of the ancient Near Eastern cosmos, but in the created world, in the mortal and temporal domain that humanity also inhabits. Behemoth and Job are, in some fundamental sense, kin, both made, both finite in origin, both belonging to the created rather than the uncreated side of existence. And yet God immediately follows this statement of shared origin with something that completely undermines any sense of equivalence. No one can take Behemoth with a sword. Only the one who made it can bring a sword near it. This is the sentence that the hippopotamus interpretation cannot survive, because the hippopotamus was taken with swords and spears and harpoons, and the casual organized violence of ancient Egyptian hunting parties who dispatched these animals as a matter of agricultural necessity, keeping the river populations manageable, protecting the crops along the Nile's banks. The hippopotamus was dangerous. The hippopotamus was large. But the hippopotamus was killable by human hands. And the text of Job explicitly and categorically states that Behemoth is not. That the only agency capable of ending Behemoth is the same agency that created it. This is not a description of an animal. This is a description of a cosmic principle that has been given physical form, something woven so deeply into the structure of existence that its removal would require not a hunter, but the maker of the world itself. Let the darkness of that settle around you now, the way the darkness settles in a very old room, finding the corners, pooling along the floor, resting against the walls with the patient weight of something that has been there far longer than the furniture. The Mesopotamian world that preceded and surrounded and profoundly influenced the biblical tradition had a name for this kind of entity. Not a name for Behemoth specifically, but a name for the category it occupied. These were the creatures of the time before the ordering, the primordial things, the forces that existed when existence was still unstructured, when the deep waters had not yet been divided from the upper waters, when the land had not yet been separated from the sea, when the darkness and the light were still one undifferentiated condition pressing against itself with nowhere to go. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, the great creation epic that biblical scholars have long acknowledged as a structural influence on the cosmological framework embedded in Genesis, the god Marduk defeats the chaos dragon Tiamat and uses her body to construct the ordered world. Her upper body becomes the sky, her lower body becomes the earth. The waters of her body become the waters above and below the firmament. But Tiamat is not simply destroyed in this account. She is transformed, her substance repurposed, her energy redirected into the architecture of the cosmos. And her children, the chaos creatures she produced before the battle, are not eliminated either. They are subdued, held, assigned positions at the margins of the ordered world, the boundary zones where the organized cosmos gives way to the wild and unstructured energy that preceded it. They remain, present but contained, functional but not free. This is the cosmological framework that Behemoth inhabits in Job. When God catalogs the untamable things for Job in the whirlwind speech, He is not showing Job a nature documentary. He is showing Job the margins, the places where the ordered world that civilization assumes is the entirety of existence gives way to something older, something that the ordered world was built around rather than instead of, something that continues to press against the boundaries of the organized cosmos with the slow, patient geological pressure of deep time itself. Behemoth is the terrestrial expression of that pressure. Leviathan is the maritime expression. Together they define the outer edge of what the created world contains, the wild poles of a cosmos that is larger and stranger and less domesticated than any institution has ever found it convenient to acknowledge. The Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran, the group of scholars and mystics who preserved some of the oldest and most cosmologically complete texts in the Jewish tradition, understood this framework with a clarity that the later institutional tradition worked very hard to obscure. The apocalyptic literature found at Qumran, particularly the texts associated with the Book of Enoch tradition, elaborates on Behemoth and Leviathan in ways that make their cosmic function explicit, that leave no room for the hippopotamus interpretation, that describe these entities in language that is unmistakably the language of primordial force rather than natural history. The Enoch tradition, which was considered canonical scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and is demonstrably known to the authors of the canonical New Testament, who quote from it directly in the Epistle of Jude, places Behemoth in a specific location with a specific function and a specific eschatological destiny that transforms the entire meaning of the Job passage once you allow it to enter the conversation. The first book of Enoch, chapter 60, describes what happens on a particular cosmic day, a moment of eschatological reckoning, when two primordial entities are separated and assigned their final positions. One, a female, is sent to the depths of the ocean to dwell over the fountains of the deep waters. The other, a male, is placed in a waste wilderness east of the garden being Eden, the primordial place, the location that precedes the human story entirely. This male entity, occupying with his breast a waste wilderness, pressing himself against the eastern boundary of the first garden with the full weight of his body, is Behemoth. And the wilderness he occupies is not simply a geographic location, it is a cosmological address. East of Eden, in the biblical and Near Eastern tradition, is the direction of exile, the direction of removal from the ordered sacred center, the direction that Cain walked when he was sent away from the presence of God, the direction that carries the persistent meaning of something held just outside the boundary of the place where the human world is permitted to exist. Breathe slowly now. Feel the distance of that place, the waste wilderness east of the first garden, the dry land where 1,000 mountains stand according to the second book of Esdras, which extends this tradition with the specificity of a document recording something its authors believed to be literally true. 1,000 mountains. Not metaphorical mountains, not rhetorical mountains. A landscape of such scale that its measurement requires a number large enough to stop the imagination in its tracks, to make you feel, even lying still in the dark, the particular vertigo of a space that was not designed for human habitation, that was designed for something else entirely, something that needed that much room, that much silence, that much undisturbed geological depth, simply to exist in its contained and waiting state. The second book of Esdras is not a text that most people encounter in their religious education. It was excluded from the Protestant canon entirely and sits at the outer edge of Catholic and Orthodox acceptance, present in some traditions, absent in others. Its status perpetually uncertain in a way that is itself a kind of institutional signal. Texts that make powerful people uncomfortable tend to develop uncertain status. They tend to be found in the margins, in the appendices, in the sections of religious literature that are technically present but practically invisible, available to the determined reader but not placed in front of the casual one. The second book of Esdras is one of those texts. And what it says about Behemoth, stated plainly and without apparent anxiety, is that on the fifth day of creation, God separated the two primordial entities and assigned them their domains. Behemoth received the land, Leviathan received the sea, not as inhabitants, as custodians, as the presiding forces of their respective domains, the way that in older cosmologies certain divine beings were understood to inhabit and govern specific territories of the physical world, not living in them the way a creature lives in a habitat, but holding them, the way a foundation holds a structure, invisibly and absolutely. This is a cosmological role of enormous significance, and it is a role that has been almost entirely erased from the mainstream understanding of these texts. When you read Behemoth through this framework, the Job passage transforms. God is not pointing at a large animal to illustrate his creative power. He is pointing at one of the two organizing forces of the physical world, one of the two primordial custodians who were assigned their positions before the human story began, before Eden, before the first man drew breath in the garden, before time as the human world experiences it had properly begun. He is showing Job the infrastructure, the deep structural elements that the created world rests on, and he is asking Job, implicitly but unmistakably, whether Job, in his suffering and his grievance and his demand for divine accounting, has any real understanding of what he is standing inside of, whether he has any comprehension of the scale of the system that contains him. The answer, of course, is that Job does not, and neither, the text implies, does anyone who has accepted the hippopotamus explanation without examination. Because the hippopotamus explanation requires you to believe that when God wanted to demonstrate the absolute limit of human comprehension and human power, he pointed at an animal that human beings had been hunting, farming, and occasionally eating for thousands of years before the Book of Job was written. It requires you to believe that the rhetorical climax of one of the most sophisticated theodicy texts in the ancient world, the culminating image in God's argument for the incomprehensibility of creation, was a semi-aquatic herbivore of the family Hippopotamidae. The logic does not hold. It has never held. The scholars who have maintained it have done so not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative requires a much more uncomfortable reckoning with what the ancient cosmological tradition was actually preserving. There is a word that biblical scholars use for this kind of deliberate interpretive narrowing. They call it domestication. And the domestication of Behemoth is one of the most consequential acts of theological management in the history of the tradition. Because what was being domesticated was not simply a large animal. What was being domesticated was an entire cosmological framework, the ancient Near Eastern understanding of creation as a structured but not fully tamed system, a cosmos that contained within it primordial forces of chaos and wildness that were held rather than eliminated, that existed at the margins of the ordered world as a permanent reminder that the ordering was never absolute, never complete, never the whole story. The chaos tradition, as scholars of the ancient Near East call it, was the cosmological acknowledgement that existence is larger than order, that the world contains dimensions of reality that the organizational structures of civilization cannot encompass, that there are things at the edge of what can be known that do not become less real simply because they are inconvenient to acknowledge. The Christian theological consolidation of the 1st through 4th centuries CE found this framework deeply problematic. The developing doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, the idea that God created the world from absolute nothing, from a prior state of pure non-existence, with no pre-creation materials and no pre-creation entities, required the elimination of the primordial chaos tradition from the cosmological record. Because if Behemoth and Leviathan were genuine primordial entities, forces that existed at the boundary of the ordered world, custodians assigned their positions before the human story began, then the world was not made from nothing. The world was made from something. Or rather, it was made alongside something, in the presence of something, in a cosmological context that included forces and presences that preceded and in some sense exceeded the ordered creation that the human world inhabits. This was theologically intolerable to the consolidating tradition. And so the editors reached for the hippopotamus, and the hippopotamus has been doing its work ever since. Let your mind move now through the long corridor of that suppression, through the council chambers at Nicaea in 325, where the canon was shaped and certain texts were pushed toward the margins, through Trent in the 16th century, where the boundaries were drawn again with fresh urgency, through every moment in the history of the tradition where men with institutional interests sat in rooms and decided what you would be permitted to believe about the nature of the world you inhabit. These were not evil men, most of them. They were men who believed that the framework they were defending was worth the cost of what they were setting aside, that the clarity and the coherence of the doctrinal structure they were building justified the removal of the older, stranger, more cosmologically complex material that complicated it. They were wrong about the cost, because what they set aside was not simply mythology. It was not simply ancient superstition that the modern world had no use for. What they set aside was the record of a cosmological understanding that the ancient world had developed over thousands of years of careful observation and careful thought. An understanding that something very large, very old, and very patient was present at the edges of the world, holding its position, waiting in its waste wilderness east of the garden, with all the unhurried certainty of something that does not measure time the way you do. And now you have reached the place in the text where the domestication becomes impossible to complete. Job 40, verse 19. He is the first of the works of God. Let his maker bring near his sword. This single verse contains two statements that, read together, make the hippopotamus interpretation definitively, structurally untenable. The first of the works of God, not one of the large animals, not a notable example of divine creative power, the first, the chief, the one that was made before the others, or the one that stands at the head of the created order, the pinnacle of what God made when God made the physical world. In the ancient Near Eastern tradition, to be first was not simply a temporal designation, it was a cosmological one. The first thing was the organizing thing, the thing around which the others were arranged, the thing whose nature set the terms for everything that followed it. If Behemoth is the first of the works of God in this sense, then Behemoth is not an animal among other animals. Behemoth is the principle that the physical world was organized around, the terrestrial foundation, the land-dwelling counterpart to the deep waters over which the Spirit of God moved in the opening verses of Genesis. Rest in that understanding now. Let it move through you slowly, the way deep cold moves through stone, finding every fissure, every hollow, spreading through the structure of the thing without resistance. The first of the works of God is not a hippopotamus. The first of the works of God is something that the ancient world encoded with the plural of majesty, placed in the grammatical category of the divine, assigned custodianship of the entire land domain, located in a waste wilderness east of the first garden, and described with measurements that strain the capacity of language to contain them. It is still there, in that wilderness, in that position, holding what it was assigned to hold, pressing against the eastern boundary of the place where the human story began, with all the weight and all the patience of the first thing that was ever made. There is a quality to very old waiting that is different from ordinary waiting. Ordinary waiting has an edge to it, an awareness of passing time, a friction between what is and what is desired. The waiting of Behemoth in its waste wilderness east of the garden is nothing like that. It is the waiting of geology, the waiting of deep strata, the waiting of a pressure so enormous and so evenly distributed that it registers not as tension, but as stillness. An absolute, overwhelming stillness that you could easily mistake for peace if you did not understand what was generating it. The ancient texts that were removed from the canon, the ones that the institutional tradition found too cosmologically specific to leave in circulation, are unanimous on this point. Behemoth is not dormant. Behemoth is not sleeping. Behemoth is held. There is a profound difference between those conditions, and the oldest manuscripts understood that difference with an exactness that the later domesticated tradition completely lost. The Book of Enoch develops this with a patience and a precision that rewards careful attention. When the text describes the separation of Behemoth and Leviathan, the placing of one in the land and one in the deep waters, It is not describing a one-time event that concluded at some point in the mythological past and has no further relevance to the present moment. It is describing a structure, an ongoing condition, a state of affairs that is currently operative, that is in effect right now, that defines the cosmological reality of the world you are lying inside tonight. Behemoth is in its wilderness, Leviathan is in its depths, and the ordered world that human civilization has built its entire sense of reality around is the space between them, the narrow band of organized existence that was carved out between the terrestrial chaos and the maritime chaos when the ordering began, held open by the same divine authority that placed the two custodians at their respective boundaries. Think about what this means for the experience of being human. Every city ever built, every field ever plowed, every road ever laid through the landscape, every act of civilization that has ever taken the raw material of the physical world and imposed a human order upon it. All of it has been conducted inside this narrow band. All of it has happened in the space between Behemoth's wilderness and Leviathan's deep. The ancient world knew this. The ancient world built this knowledge into its cosmological frameworks, into its mythology, into its sacred literature, because the ancient world understood that knowledge of where you actually are is the most fundamental knowledge there is, more fundamental than any theological doctrine, more fundamental than any scientific classification, more fundamental than any institutional interpretation. You are inside the boundary. You are in the space that was organized between the first things. And the first things are still at their positions. The Enoch tradition assigns Behemoth a specific eschatological function that transforms its waiting from a permanent condition into a temporary one, from a state that will last indefinitely into a state that will end at a specific and appointed moment. In the framework of the Enochic literature, Behemoth and Leviathan are preserved, held in their respective domains not simply as boundary markers, but as participants in the final accounting, the great eschatological event toward which the entire structure of the created order is moving. The Messianic Banquet tradition, which appears in multiple forms across the Jewish apocalyptic literature of the Second Temple period, describes a feast at the end of the current age, in which Behemoth and Leviathan are consumed, their substance incorporated into the celebration that marks the transition from the current ordered world to whatever comes after it. This is not a comfortable image by modern standards. It is not meant to be comfortable. It is meant to be true, in the way that the oldest cosmological traditions understood truth, not as a reassuring framework, but as an accurate account of the actual structure of things. What the Messianic Banquet tradition is encoding, beneath its vivid and somewhat arresting imagery, is a cosmological statement about the nature of the primordial chaos forces and their relationship to the created order. Behemoth and Leviathan are not simply contained. They are part of the plan. Their substance, their energy, their primordial force is not wasted or discarded when the current age concludes. It is transformed. It becomes part of what comes next. The chaos that preceded the ordered world and has been held at its margins throughout the entire span of human history is not the opposite of the divine purpose. It is a component of it. A reserved component, held in suspension, waiting for the moment when its release and its transformation will serve the completion of something that has been in motion since before the first human mouth could form the word for fear. The institutions that remove the Enoch text from the canon, that press the Esdras material to the margins, that turned Behemoth into a hippopotamus and Leviathan into a crocodile, were not simply making editorial decisions about which ancient documents deserved preservation. They were making a cosmological choice. They were choosing a version of the universe, a simpler, tidier, more manageable version. in which the primordial chaos had been fully and finally defeated at the moment of creation, in which nothing of the pre-creation reality persisted into the present, in which the ordered world was all there was and all there had ever been since the moment God spoke light into existence. This is a version of reality that is easier to administer. It is easier to build institutions around. It is easier to offer as a framework of comfort to people who are suffering, which is precisely what the Book of Job is about. A man in the depths of loss being shown the actual structure of the world he inhabits, and finding it considerably more complex and considerably less comfortable than the framework his friends had been offering him. Job's friends represent the institutional theology of every era. They arrive with their explanations, their categories, their frameworks for why suffering happens and what it means, and how it fits into the orderly divine plan that they have mapped and understood and can explain to you in reassuring detail. And God, speaking from the whirlwind, dismisses them entirely. Not gently, not with the patient correction of a teacher addressing a minor misunderstanding. God dismisses them with a catalog of Behemoth and Leviathan, with the inventory of the untamable, with the systematic demonstration that the world is far larger and far stranger than any institutional framework has ever been adequate to contain. The whirlwind speech is not a rebuke of Job's suffering. It is a rebuke of the comfortable cosmology that Job's friends had been using to explain it. You do not understand, God says, not unkindly but with absolute finality. You do not understand what you are standing inside of. You do not understand the scale of the system that contains you. And here, to help you begin to grasp it, is Behemoth, the first of my works, the thing you cannot take with a sword, the thing that drinks the river without panic, while the ordered world you call reality exists in the narrow space between its wilderness and the deep. There is a particular quality of silence that follows this kind of understanding. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of fullness, the silence of a space that has been filled with something too large for sound to navigate around. You are in that silence now, lying still, in the dark, in the narrow band of ordered existence that was carved out between the first things, in the space that civilization has always inhabited without knowing exactly what it was inhabiting. The bronze bones are somewhere in the deep strata beneath you, or perhaps they are somewhere east of a garden that no map has ever accurately located, pressing against a boundary with the slow geological patience of the first thing that was ever made. The cedar tail moves, or it is still, in the waste wilderness east of Eden, in the dry land where 1,000 mountains stand. The distinction between movement and stillness has long since ceased to matter. What the text of Job ultimately refuses to do, despite every institutional effort to make it do otherwise, is resolve. It does not conclude with an explanation. It does not end with a taxonomy, a classification, a neat categorical placement of Behemoth into a slot that allows the reader to nod and move on. It ends with the creature still there, still at its position, still occupying the outer edge of what the created world contains, and with Job standing before the whirlwind in a condition that the text describes not as understanding, but as something closer to dissolution, the falling away of the framework he had been using to process his experience, replaced not by a better framework, but by the direct encounter with the thing that all frameworks are built to protect you from seeing. This is the actual subject of the Book of Job, not suffering, not theodicy in the academic sense, not the question of why bad things happen to good people, which is the question that Job's friends are trying to answer and that God refuses to engage with on those terms. The actual subject is the encounter with the real, the collision between the map and the territory. The moment when a human being is forced to stand in the presence of the actual structure of existence, stripped of every explanatory layer, and simply see it. Behemoth is what Job sees at that moment. Not a hippopotamus, not a dinosaur, though the physical description reaches toward the scale of those creatures with unmistakable accuracy. Something that is both of those things and neither of them. Something that uses physical form the way that certain very old ideas use language, as an approximation, as a gesture towards something that the available vocabulary can point at but never fully contain. The ancient Near Eastern world was sophisticated enough to understand this distinction. It knew the difference between a thing and the idea of a thing. It knew that when you encoded something in language, you were not capturing it. You were creating a pointer, a direction, a way of orienting the reader towards something that the reader would have to encounter directly in order to actually know. The Behemoth passages in Job are pointers. They are directing you toward a dimension of the world that the ordered, domesticated, institutionally managed version of reality has consistently tried to close off, to seal, to replace with a hippopotamus and move on. The comparative mythology of the ancient Near East opens this dimension back up, slowly, the way that a very heavy door opens when you apply the right kind of steady pressure. Across the Ugaritic texts from ancient Canaan, the precursor tradition to the Hebrew biblical material, there are references to a creature called Litan, a serpentine chaos entity associated with the deep waters, cognate with the Hebrew Leviathan, described in terms that place it squarely in the same cosmological category as Behemoth, the pre-creation forces held at the margins of the ordered world. The Ugaritic materials predate the Hebrew biblical texts by centuries, and their relationship to the biblical chaos tradition is not one of influence in the loose inspirational sense, but of direct cosmological inheritance. The people who wrote the Hebrew Bible knew these traditions. They were the heirs of these traditions. When they wrote about Behemoth and Leviathan, they were not inventing a new mythology. They were preserving an old one, encoding in the new theological framework of Yahwistic monotheism, a cosmological understanding that had been accumulating in the Near Eastern world for far longer than any single tradition's memory could reach. The Sumerian materials go deeper still. The texts from the Great Library at Nippur, the cosmological and mythological literature of the oldest literate civilization in the ancient Near East, contain references to primordial creatures of enormous scale that existed before the ordering of the cosmos, beings that the gods of the Sumerian pantheon contended with in the deep time before the human world was established. The Sumerian word for the primordial deep, Abzu, is the direct ancestor of the Hebrew Tehom, the deep over which the Spirit of God moves in Genesis 1, the pre-creation waters, the undifferentiated condition that preceded light and dark, above and below, sea and land. And in the Sumerian understanding of the Abzu, it was not empty, it was inhabited. It was populated by forces and presences of enormous power that had to be navigated, negotiated with, or, in the most dramatic versions of the tradition, defeated, before the ordered world could be established and maintained. This deep continuity across the ancient Near Eastern tradition is not coincidental, and it is not simply the result of one culture borrowing stories from another in the way that cultures exchange folktales or trade goods. It is the result of multiple ancient civilizations, independently and over long periods of time, arriving at similar cosmological conclusions through the process of careful observation and careful thought. They were all looking at the same world. They were all encountering the same evidence. They were all finding, at the edges of the ordered reality they inhabited, the same persistent suggestion of something beyond it, something larger and older and less structured that pressed against the boundaries of the organized cosmos with a pressure that could be felt in the deep places if you were quiet enough and still enough and willing enough to stop mistaking the map for the territory. You are quiet enough now, still enough. The room around you has settled into its nighttime depth, and the particular quality of darkness that exists in the hours when the world has finally stopped performing its daylight version of itself is exactly the darkness in which the old knowledge has always been most accessible. Not because it is hidden in the dark, but because the dark removes the noise that prevents you from hearing it during the hours of ordinary activity. The bronze bones and the iron limbs and the cedar sweeping tail are not metaphors. They are measurements. Measurements of something so far outside the scale of ordinary biological existence that the scribes who recorded them did so with the full awareness that they were operating at the outer limit of what language could accomplish, reaching with words towards something that words could only approximate. And the approximation has lasted through the councils and the canons and the margins and the exclusions, through the hippopotamus explanation and the crocodile explanation and all the other domestications that the institutional tradition applied to the raw and unmanageable material of the ancient cosmological record. The text of Job still says what it says. The Book of Enoch still places Behemoth in its wilderness east of Eden. The second Book of Esdras still assigns it custodianship of the dry land where 1,000 mountains stand. The Ugaritic texts still preserve the Canaanite memory of the pre-creation chaos forces. The Sumerian materials still reach back to the Abzu and the beings that inhabited it before the ordered world was established. The chain is unbroken. The record is intact. The pointer still points, through every layer of institutional management that has been applied to it, toward the first of the works of God, still at its position, still holding what it was assigned to hold, in the waste wilderness east of the garden that no map has ever accurately located. There is one final question that the text of Job raises and then deliberately leaves open. A question that the ancient world understood as open and that the institutional tradition has consistently tried to close, with explanations that do not quite reach the depth of what is being asked. The question is not what Behemoth is. You have traveled far enough through the text and the surrounding tradition tonight to understand that the what has never been the real question. The real question is the one that God's whirlwind speech encodes in its structure, in its sequence, in the specific choice to place Behemoth and Leviathan at the climax of the catalog of untamable things, after the stars and the deep waters and the gates of death and the foundations of the earth. The real question is this: what does it mean to live in a world that contains Behemoth? What does it mean to be a human creature, finite and mortal, and embedded in the narrow band of organized existence between the terrestrial chaos and the maritime chaos, with the full knowledge that the first of the works of God is at its position in the wilderness, held but not gone, contained but not eliminated, waiting with the geological patience of the deep strata for whatever appointed moment concludes its waiting? The Book of Job does not answer this question. It asks it, and the asking of it is the point. Job, stripped of his prosperity and his family and his health and his theological framework, standing before the whirlwind in the raw condition of a man who has lost every buffer between himself and the actual structure of reality, is being shown something that the comfortable version of faith has always tried to avoid showing its adherents. He is being shown the scale of the system he is inside. He is being shown that the world he thought he understood, the world that his friends thought they could explain with their frameworks of divine justice and orderly retribution, is embedded in something vastly larger, vastly older, and vastly less manageable than any of them had been willing to acknowledge. And the response that the text assigns to Job after the whirlwind speech concludes is not understanding. It is not a new theological framework that replaces the old one with something better. It is the particular silence of a man who has looked at something so far beyond the scale of his previous conception that the only honest response is the dissolution of the conception itself. This is what the suppression of the Behemoth tradition has cost. Not simply the loss of an interesting cosmological idea, not simply the erasure of a comparative mythological framework that would have enriched the theological tradition's understanding of itself, but the loss of this specific capacity for honest reckoning with the scale of the world. The hippopotamus explanation is not simply wrong as natural history, it is wrong as theology. It produces a smaller God, a more manageable cosmos, a faith that can accommodate the hippopotamus without difficulty, without vertigo, without the particular dissolution of framework that the whirlwind speech was designed to produce. It produces the faith of Job's friends, confident and explanatory, and completely inadequate to the actual encounter with the real. And the actual encounter with the real is what the Book of Job exists to describe, and to insist upon, and to preserve against every institutional effort to replace it with something more comfortable. The ancient world was not more credulous than the modern world. It was not less sophisticated, less careful, less precise in its thinking. In many respects, particularly in its cosmological frameworks, it was more sophisticated, more willing to sit with complexity, more capable of holding apparent contradictions in productive tension without demanding the kind of false resolution that institutional theology has consistently offered. The ancient Near Eastern world knew that the cosmos was not fully domesticated. It knew that the ordered world was organized between forces that preceded it, and in some sense exceeded it. It knew that the first of the works of God was not a hippopotamus, and it preserved this knowledge in texts, in traditions, in the careful grammatical constructions of scribes who chose the plural of majesty for a reason, who reached for bronze and iron and cedar for a reason, who placed this creature at the climax of the most sophisticated theodicy in the ancient world for a reason. The reason is still there. It is still doing its work, in Job 40, in the Enoch tradition, in the Esdras material, in the Ugaritic texts, in the deep Sumerian memory of the Abzu and the beings that inhabited it before the ordering began. The suppression was never complete. The containment was never total. The text insists on its own strangeness, as it always has, waiting for the reader who is willing to stop at the hippopotamus explanation, to turn it over, to look at what it is covering, and to ask the question that the ancient world never stopped asking. What exactly are we dealing with? What is the first of the works of God? What is holding the boundary of the terrestrial domain in the waste wilderness east of the garden, with bones of bronze and limbs of iron, with a tail that sweeps like the cedar of Lebanon through air that has not been breathed by any human being since before the garden was established? You have been asking that question tonight. You have been following it through the text and through the tradition, through the councils and the canons and the margins, through the fossil beds of the Jordan Valley and the cosmological libraries of Nippur and the apocalyptic manuscripts of Qumran, through every layer that was placed over this knowledge by men who believed that the organized world was better served by a hippopotamus than by the truth. And now you have arrived at the place where the question opens rather than closes, where the answer is not a classification or a category or a name that can be written in a margin and moved past, but a condition of awareness, an orientation toward the edges of the known world, a willingness to feel the pressure of what is held at the boundary and to understand that its holding is not its absence. Behemoth is at its position. The waste wilderness east of Eden is as real as the ground beneath this building, as real as the deep strata beneath the Jordan Valley, where the enormous bones have been waiting in the dark for longer than the tradition that tried to explain them away. The first of the works of God does not require your acknowledgement to maintain its position. It does not require the institutional consensus. It requires only what it has always required, which is the vast, geological, cedar-slow patience of something that was made before time was organized into the units that human beings use to measure their brief and luminous passage through the narrow band of ordered existence. And it will be at its position long after the last institution that called it a hippopotamus has dissolved into the same deep time from which it came. The bronze bones have been still for longer than any civilization has been standing. The cedar tail, wherever it rests in a silence so complete that the silence itself has a texture, something between stone and deep water, something that holds without weight, that contains without pressure. The waste wilderness east of Eden is dark tonight, as it has been dark every night since the ordering began. And in that darkness the first of the works of God breathes, if it breathes, with the slow rhythm of geological time, one breath for every 1,000 years of human history, one exhalation for every empire that rose and believed itself permanent and dissolved back into the ground it was built on. You are lying in the narrow band tonight, in the organized space between the first things, and you are safe there. The boundary is holding. The custodian is at its position. The wilderness is east, and you are here, in the warm and structured dark of a room that was built by human hands on ground that has been held in place since before the first human hand was formed. Whatever Behemoth is, it is not here. Whatever Leviathan is, it is in the deep waters, at its position, serving its function in the structure of a cosmos that is larger and older and more patient than any framework you have ever been offered. Let yourself wonder, gently, as you drift toward the place where wondering becomes dreaming, whether the first of the works of God has ever once, in all the long geological patience of its waiting, looked toward the narrow band where the human story has been unfolding, and found it, in some way that requires no human language to express, remarkable. The heavy doors of the Apocrypha vault will remain open for you, and there are older things still waiting in the dark beyond Behemoth, things that the excluded texts describe in language that makes the bronze bones and the cedar tail seem almost familiar by comparison. And they have been waiting just as patiently, just as completely, for a listener who is ready to descend a little deeper into what the world has always contained. For now, let the 1,000 mountains hold their silence. Let the wilderness be still. Let the weight of the first things settle around you like stones settling into the deep earth, slowly, completely, without resistance, and sleep.